The heavy wooden door to the private hospital room slammed open with enough force to rattle the glass in the windows. Richard stormed into the sterile space, his face twisted into that familiar, ugly mask of absolute rage. He had his speech perfectly rehearsed, his chest puffed out, his shoulders squared, pulling all the oxygen out of the room just like he always did. He marched toward my bed, fully prepared to scream at me for surviving a catastrophic blizzard. He was ready to tell me how much I embarrassed the family name by ending up in a Denver intensive care unit, instead of quietly freezing to death on that desolate mountain pass. He opened his mouth, drawing in a massive breath to deliver his venom. Then, he stopped dead. His eyes finally locked onto the elegant, impeccably dressed woman sitting calmly in the leather armchair beside my bed. Alicia slowly crossed her legs, resting her hands on her lap, and offered a predatory, freezing smile that held zero warmth. The explosive anger melted right off Richard's face in a fraction of a second. The color drained from his cheeks until his skin turned a sickening, translucent shade of gray. His broad shoulders collapsed inward. His large hands started shaking so violently he had to reach out and grab the metal edge of the doorframe just to keep his knees from buckling beneath him. He stared in absolute horror at his former business partner. He stared at the brilliant woman he had systematically defrauded out of millions of dollars. He stared at the ghost he assumed had died in absolute financial ruin 13 years ago. "You," he whispered. His voice cracked, stripping away every ounce of his manufactured authority. "You died 13 years ago." Elysia tilted her head. She looked at him the exact way a starving hawk looks at a cornered, injured mouse. The power dynamic in that hospital room shifted in a single, deafening heartbeat. For the absolute first time in my entire life, my tyrant of a father was the one paralyzed by pure, suffocating terror. Watching him shake in the dim light of that hospital room, my 15-year-old self finally realized the terrifying monster of my childhood was just a pathetic, hollow coward. They broke my spirit back then. But today, I am the one holding the hammer. To truly understand how I built an untouchable empire out of absolute ice, you have to rewind exactly 24 hours before Elysia made him tremble. You have to understand the daily suffocating nightmare of being the designated punching bag in a house built entirely on lies. I spent 3 agonizing weeks sitting hunched over a second-hand sewing machine, meticulously stitching a pale blue graduation dress out of cheap clearance fabric. Richard flatly refused to spend a single dollar on my milestone, claiming I did not deserve a celebration for doing the bare minimum. Eudora, my younger sister and the undisputed golden child of the house, despised seeing me create anything beautiful. She thrived on my misery. The moment I stepped out of my bedroom to get a glass of water, she snuck inside. She grabbed my heavy iron fabric scissors and viciously shredded the blue fabric into useless, jagged ribbons. She tore the seams apart until the dress was nothing more than a pile of rags. Then, without a second of hesitation, she dragged the sharp edge of the blade across her own forearm, leaving a shallow, dramatic, bleeding scratch. She dropped the heavy scissors onto the hardwood floor and let out a blood-curdling scream. Richard burst through my bedroom door before I even registered what was happening. He skipped the questions. He bypassed any attempt at understanding the situation. He simply swung his heavy right hand and cracked me across the jaw with everything he had. The heavy gold signet ring on his index finger tore the delicate skin right on my cheekbone. I hit the floor hard, tasting hot copper and tasting dust, my vision exploding into bright white flashes. "Are you trying to kill your sister?" he roared, spit flying from his lips, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. "You cold-blooded, selfish freak. You are just jealous of her. You hate that she actually matters." Eudora immediately scrambled behind his legs, clutching her bleeding arm and sobbing dry, theatrical tears. She looked down at me, a tiny, malicious smirk playing on her lips, and whispered that I wanted her dead. I looked up from the floor, my head spinning, desperate for a single lifeline. My mother stood completely frozen in the doorway. She stared blankly at the faded floral wallpaper, completely avoiding the sight of my bleeding face and my bruised jaw. She crossed her arms, letting out a long, put-upon sigh. "Alice, just bow your head and apologize to your sister," my mother murmured, her voice dripping with lazy, weaponized exhaustion. "Do not argue with your father right now. Swallow your pride. Why must you always make things so difficult for everyone else in this house?" She demanded I set myself on fire just to keep her fragile, cowardly world warm. She was the enabler, the silent architect of my daily torture, demanding I absorb the abuse so she would never have to confront her husband's monstrous nature. That violent afternoon was merely the warm-up. The true execution happened exactly 6 hours later. Eudora slipped out of the house and pawned Richard's $50,000 vintage watch collection to cover her massive, secret gambling debts. To hide her tracks, she staged a burglary. She trashed his pristine home office. She ripped up his detailed financial ledgers, knocked over his heavy mahogany bookshelves, shattered his crystal decanters, and then pointed her trembling, manicured finger straight at me. Richard went entirely feral. The rage completely consumed his rationality. He grabbed the back of my thin cotton shirt collar and dragged me out of my room. My bare knees slammed against the sharp edges of the hardwood stairs as he pulled me down, step by brutal step. I choked against the tight fabric. I gasped for air, begging him to stop, begging him to just look at the bright yellow pawnshop receipts still sticking out of Eudora's designer purse on the entryway table. He ignored the evidence completely. He threw me violently toward the heavy oak front door. "What are you crying for?" he spat, his eyes bulging with irrational fury. "Your tears are filthy. Give me my things back. You cheap little thief. I would rather throw you to the wild dogs than keep a traitor in my house for one more second." My mother quietly stepped backward into her bedroom, averted her eyes, and clicked the brass lock shut. Richard shoved me into the back seat of his SUV. He locked the doors and drove 5 miles up a pitch-black mountain road straight into a brutal Denver blizzard. He slammed on the brakes, dragged me out by my hair, and threw my thin shoes into a snowbank. I stood in the heavy drifts, shivering violently in a thin sweater and jeans. "You love playing the victim so much," he sneered, his cruel voice cutting sharply through the howling wind. "Go act with the Grim Reaper. Survive or do not survive. I am completely done with you. Get out of my sight." He slammed the door and sped off, his taillights vanishing into the blinding whiteout. He intentionally left a 15-year-old girl miles from civilization to freeze to death. The cold hit like a physical beating. I stumbled forward, my bare feet going completely numb. Every time headlights flickered in the distance, my chest leaped with hope that he had come back. But the cars just splashed past. Eventually, my body began to shut down. The shivering stopped, replaced by a terrifying lethargy. My vision blurred, my knees buckled on the frozen asphalt, and my head cracked against the icy gravel as I welcomed the absolute silence. I woke up to the sterile scent of rubbing alcohol and the steady beep of a heart monitor. The bone-chilling cold was gone, replaced by the warmth of a hospital blanket. I turned my head and saw Alicia sitting perfectly still in the armchair. Alicia skipped the pleasantries. When Richard arrived to scream at me, she dropped a thick manila folder onto my tray. The crisp pages held an undeniable paper trail of every dollar he stole from her firm decades ago. 2 police officers stood outside, waiting to ask why a snowplow driver found his teenage daughter turning blue on a desolate road. Alicia gave him an uncompromising choice sign over full legal guardianship and walk away forever, or face federal fraud and child endangerment charges. Richard's ego shattered. Pure panic hijacked his nervous system. His hands shook violently as he scratched his signature onto the guardianship papers, surrendering me like defective machinery. He avoided my eyes completely. My mother hovered near the sink, weeping softly, offering nothing but useless background noise. I walked out of that hospital room clutching Alicia's warm coat, leaving the toxic architects of my misery behind. My childhood fear hardened into unbreakable focus. Under Alicia's demanding mentorship, I traded frostbitten toes for tailored suits and cutthroat boardrooms. I clawed my way to the top, eventually taking the helm of her global philanthropic foundation as CEO. I navigated a world of ruthless executives with the exact ice water Richard forced into my veins. While I built a fortress, Richard dug his own grave. He bet his entire financial future on his golden child, and Eudora delivered the fatal blow. Shielded from accountability her whole life, she kept pushing limits. When she crashed her luxury car while intoxicated, injuring a pedestrian, she needed a massive settlement to avoid prison. She forged Richard's signature and drained every drop of equity from his struggling business. The child he worshipped became the venom that destroyed him. He lost his mansion to the bank and his cars to repo men. He ended up rotting in a drafty duplex, utterly ruined by the daughter he protected at my expense. 13 winters passed. I stood in the sweeping marble lobby of my charity headquarters, sipping coffee. Outside, a pathetic circus unfolded. Richard and Eudora stood in the freezing wind, surrounded by local news crews and flashing cameras. Richard clutched a reporter's microphone with desperate hands. "She is an ungrateful, heartless monster," Richard wailed, squeezing out forced tears. "I raised her. I fed her. I gave her everything. Now she sits up there in her billionaire glass tower while her own flesh and blood starves in the street. She completely abandoned her family." Eudora huddled next to him, shivering dramatically. They intended to weaponize the media, hoping public outrage would force me to write a massive extortion check to save my foundation's reputation. They expected me to panic. They forgot I survived the blizzard they left me in. I pushed the heavy glass doors open myself. I ignored the shouting reporters and gestured toward the private elevator, inviting my tormentors up to the executive boardroom. Richard stepped into the elevator with a smug smirk, fully believing he had won. Eudora dropped her tragic victim act the second the doors shut, transforming into a calculating vulture. They eagerly took their seats at the polished mahogany table. I opened my folio, pulled out a single certified cashier's check, and placed it perfectly in the center of the table. $1 million. Their eyes locked onto the paper with raw, visceral hunger. Richard reached for it, but I pinned the check down. Beside it, I placed a pen and a single legal document, a complete confession and transfer of liability. "I will buy your silence," I stated, keeping my voice utterly hollow. "But I am only paying one of you. The rules of this transaction are extremely simple. Whoever signs this confession of liability takes the $1 million right now, free and clear. The other person absorbs the entire legal debt of your shattered estate, takes the criminal fall for the extortion attempt happening downstairs, and goes to state prison. Decide right now." The fake mask of family loyalty vaporized instantly. Survival instinct kicked in, and they turned on each other with breathtaking savagery. They lunged for the pen simultaneously. Richard violently backhanded Eudora's arm away. "You are the child. You step aside for me," Richard roared, his spit hitting the polished mahogany. "I indulged you for years. You stole that $50,000 vintage watch and framed her for it. I knew it the whole time, but I covered for you. I kept you out of jail. Now you owe me. You step back and let me sign." He confessed on his own, without a single prompt. He admitted knowing my innocence the night he threw me into the snow. I leaned back and watched the chaotic carnage unfold. Eudora dug her sharp nails into his wrist, drawing blood. "Shut up!" Eudora screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill shriek. "You are a useless, broke old man. That money goes to you and the creditors will just seize it anyway. You are the one who dragged her out into the blizzard. You threw a 15-year-old out to freeze. Not me. The one who deserves to rot in prison is you." They clawed at each other. Richard grabbed Eudora by her collar and cracked his heavy hand across her face with a sickening thud. Her cheek slammed against the table, drawing blood from her lip. She looked up in paralyzing shock, experiencing the exact monster she had hidden behind her whole life. It was the same slap he gave me 13 years ago. Eudora hit the floor sobbing. Richard ignored her, snatched the pen, and hovered over the signature line with a sickening, victorious grin. I smiled. I tapped my iPad and slid it across the mahogany directly into his line of sight. He blinked and glanced down. His hand froze in midair. The pen slipped from his trembling fingers. His arrogant victory was instantly replaced by suffocating panic. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His pupils dilated into wide black holes, and he let out a dry, choking gasp. The iPad displayed a live, high-definition video feed of our entire confrontation. Below, it scrolled the names of the billionaires on my board of directors, the men holding his crushing corporate debt, and the verified accounts for the Denver Police Department. They heard every word. They watched him assault his daughter, confess to covering up grand theft, admit to abandoning a minor in a deadly storm, and commit textbook criminal extortion. "You..." Richard choked out, struggling to pull air into his failing lungs. "You set us up." "I gave you a mirror," I replied, my voice completely dead. "You did the rest all by yourself." The boardroom doors burst open. 4 uniformed police officers flooded in, bypassing me entirely. 2 grabbed Richard, slamming him face first onto the table to handcuff him. 2 others hauled a screaming Eudora off the floor. The reality of his destruction finally snapped Richard's spine. His knees buckled. As the officers pulled him upright, he slumped toward the floor in tears, sobbing a pathetic, miserable sound. "Alice, please," he begged, his voice cracking violently. "I am your father. You cannot do this to your own blood. Please, show some mercy. Tell them it was a misunderstanding." I walked slowly around the table, looking down into his desperate eyes. My heart beat with a steady, peaceful rhythm. The terrifying monster from my childhood was gone, leaving only a weak, sweating old man. "You were right about one thing, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. "Your tears are filthy now. Stop playing the victim. Your rot runs deep in your blood. Enjoy the rest of your life in a concrete cell." I turned my back and walked out without hesitation. The police dragged them toward the freight elevators, their frantic screams fading into the hum of the building. The cycle was finally broken. The judge's wooden gavel officially ended Richard Carter's empire. The justice system struck with crushing finality, showing zero mercy. The judge sentenced Richard to 12 years in federal prison for extortion, fraud, and child endangerment, plus a massive $2.5 million restitution that wiped out his remaining assets. Eudora sobbed violently as she received a severe 6-year sentence for forgery, grand theft, and conspiracy. Social destruction followed. Our foundation released the raw footage to the press, the wealthy circles, neighbors, and partners who once praised him turned their backs simultaneously. He became a radioactive pariah overnight. And my mother got exactly what she always demanded: complete peace and quiet. Stranded in a cheap motel on the edge of the city, she would wait forever for a husband and a golden child who were never coming back. She chose the abusers, and her final reward was spending the rest of her life entirely alone. 14 months later, the ghost reached out. A cheap envelope with a prison stamp arrived on my desk. Richard poured his best manipulation into those shaky lines. He complained about his failing health, the cold floors, and isolation, pulling familiar strings of guilt. He wrote that he was a sick, old man facing the end alone, and that he was still my father. He wanted a reaction fury, tears, or forgiveness just to know he still occupied real estate in my mind. I held the letter over my silver shredder and let go. The machine hummed for 2 seconds, tearing his desperate apology into meaningless ribbons. I tossed the envelope into the recycling bin. My pulse stayed perfectly steady. My chest felt entirely light. Today, my life looks nothing like the freezing nightmare of my childhood. I step into my home and find unconditional peace. The holidays are no longer landmines. My table is surrounded by people who bring warmth and absolute safety. Alicia sits at the head, offering sharp wisdom. My colleagues and close friends are my chosen family. We share joyful meals in a house where nobody ever raises a hand in anger. Sitting in my office, watching the snow fall across the Denver skyline. I need anyone listening who recognizes the terror of walking on eggshells in their own home to hear these 3 rules. Rule number 1. The enabler is never your ally. We hate the monster throwing punches, but give a free pass to the coward holding the door shut. My mother watched me drown and complained my splashing was too loud. Silence in the face of abuse is active participation. You owe them absolutely nothing. Rule number 2. Narcissists eventually destroy themselves. You never need to climb into the mud to fight them. They are parasites. Cut off their supply. Give them a mirror and the rope of their own greed, and they will tear their own lives apart. Let consequence do its job. Rule number 3. Indifference is the ultimate victory. Hate requires exhausting energy. When their triumphs mean nothing to you and their tragedies evoke zero sympathy, you are truly free. Absolute victory is looking directly at the person who shattered your childhood and feeling nothing at all. Blood does not make you family. Loyalty and mutual protection do. You have the absolute right to walk away from people who hurt you, even if you share their last name. Trust is earned, never owed through biology. If someone demands you set yourself on fire to keep them warm, turn your back. Let them freeze. Have you ever had to cut off a toxic family member to save your own life? Tell me your story in the comments. And subscribe if you are finally ready to stop apologizing for surviving.